I recently came into a big pile of RPGs to review and was a little overwhelmed by it all, but there were two books that emerged as trying to do the same thing, but going about it in vastly different ways. Those books were The Caverns of Thracia, an all-time classic D&D dungeon from the 70s, re-released by Goodman Games in both Dungeon Crawl Classics and D&D 5e rules, and The Devoured Labyrinth, a collection of 1- and 2-page dungeons keyed to the Shadow Dark rule set. I tried prepping sessions using both books because I've been having this itch to run a dungeon, and in the course of doing so, I discovered all kinds of things about dungeon presentation. There's no one perfect way to design or present a dungeon, but in this video I want to show you the pros and cons of the two approaches that manifest in these two books. Let's start with The Caverns of Thracia. The Caverns of Thracia is this hollowed, much beloved classic D&D dungeon written and illustrated by Janelle Jacques, published in 1979 by a company called Judges Guild, which put out a lot of sandboxy type supplements for D&D at the time. It's essentially a mega dungeon comprised of 4 levels, but each level is understandably pretty involved. The original dungeon ran 78 pages, but a lot of these pages are dense and text-filled, just begging for an overhaul, despite being hailed as one of the greatest dungeons ever made. And that's where Goodman Games came in. In 2024, they ran a crowdfund for an overhaul of the Caverns of Thracia, both for their DCC rule set as well as D&D 5e, and that very successful crowdfund campaign resulted in this. The sort of main attraction, in my opinion, is the DCC hardcover, featuring a frankly astounding illustration by the artist San Julian. The in-papers on the front feature more fun, very Goodman Games-esque work, and the book itself contains some very nice forewords that discuss the historical importance of this dungeon, an interview with Janelle, the author, the original publication in full from 1979, and an expanded DCC version of the dungeon with tons of extra artwork, updated maps, and ostensibly clearer presentation of the areas and enemies found in the dungeon. This book, like all Goodman Games hardcovers, is stitch bound and pretty high quality. I'll get into what I think about all these text walls in a second, but it's worth noting that the book is also loaded with tons of new artwork for the dungeon, and it ends with yet another Goodman Games style banger in the end papers. Apologies for not knowing the name of the artist for these end paper illustrations. My hunch is that they are a regular contributor of Goodman Games because I see the same style across all of the publisher's works. Okay, so then there's this sort of one-of-a-kind relic that I've never encountered before. It's the same book, Caverns of Thracia for DCC, but the cover is this sort of soft, rubbery latex that has been treated to feel like the hide of a cow or other bovine. Well, I guess in this case, a minotaur. And on top of that, there's a polychromatic gold foil treatment for the art and lettering. It's really pretty extraordinary. I think these collector's editions drive a lot of Goodman Games' sales, so it's not a surprise that the company has gotten really, really good at making these editions feel really unique and worth treasuring. But yeah, the interior of the book is identical to the standard cover version as far as I was able to tell. Rounding out the fulfillment for this campaign were 5 relatively short staple-bound booklets, each containing a standalone adventure. Hell Pits of Nightfang, originally by Janelle Jacques and converted to DCC. Grave Robbers of Thracia, a level 0 adventure by Bob Brinkman and branded as a Caverns of Thracia adventure. If you're not familiar with level 0 adventures in Dungeon Crawl Classics, they're these deadly funnels where each player starts with up to 4 super weak characters, and the idea is that most of them are dead by the end of the session, but hopefully every player still has 1 character alive. That character goes on to become a level 1 starting character in the next session. It's a lot of fun. There's Beneath the Isle of the Serpents, a level 1 adventure by Bob Brinkman and also branded as a Caverns of Thracia adventure. And finally, The Sacrificial Pyre of Thracia, a level 1 adventure written by Scott Moore, obviously carrying the Caverns of Thracia branding. But wait, there's more. Goodman Games also published a 5e version of Caverns of Thracia, and this one claims the original cover by Jacques published in 1979. It's all very nostalgic, except that it's keyed to 5e, which I would consider quasi-modern at this point. The end papers contain a different illustration than the DCC version. This might be a bit of a spoiler here, but come on, you knew that you were going to be fighting a Minotaur at some point in this dungeon. The interior is all but identical, except for the stats and mechanics being 5e. There is also that awesome Minotaur hide cover rendered with 5e rules. They just did the exact same cover because it's so awesome and they knew it. The booklet offerings on this side of the product line have a couple of changes. You have Hell Pits of Nightfang with the original cover art, Beneath the Isle of Serpents with the same cover as the DCC version, the Alabaster Tower of Thracia with a wicked cover by David Griffith, the Sacrificial Pyre of Thracia, and a reference guide sort of book called Monsters and Magic of Thracia, written by both Bob Brinkman and Scott Moore, and keyed to both DCC and 5e rules. So all that being said, with the huge collection of beautiful, collectible, colorful, high-quality books, what does the dungeon look like in its refreshed version? Well, it starts with a long history of the semi-historical Thracia, this sort of city-state in ancient Greece, but with lizard men. Then importantly, there are the 8 factions in the dungeon, and language. Once you get to the start of the dungeon adventure, Bob Brinkman's version of the dungeon is good. It draws you in, and I mean that as a GM trying to prep this dungeon for actual play. The entrance is this classic tree-enshrouded ruin, a forgotten temple of some forgotten god. There's even a secret entrance, classic. You go down the stairs, run into a band of tribals. The areas are each described in relatively short paragraphs here, and it's nice. But already we're seeing a problem. Notice how on the previous page we had the start of Area B's description? Well, it continues 2 pages later. I find that splitting paragraphs or even sections like this is just an unfriendly practice. But let's move on to the actual dungeon proper. Okay, so the map itself is brilliant. Justin Alexander of the award-winning Alexandrian blog has discussed this fact at length on how there are all these different elements that make a dungeon interesting. In fact, you can take any plain dungeon and jackway it by adding things like multiple entrances, loops, multiple level connections. Justin actually includes all of these techniques on both his blog and in the foreword to another Janelle Jackway classic revived by Goodman Games called Dark Tower. The map is the good part, but here's the problem. This is too much description, and this pullout box discussing the bat-infested hallway is also too much. And when I say too much, I mean it's too much for me personally, someone who prepped the first level of this dungeon and needed to have most or all of this map's rooms semi-memorized for the session. I could always go back and reference these pages during the session, but that's really where the problem kicks in. Referencing all of this is not easy or fast. Also, under no circumstances am I going to be reading this text in italics out loud to my players. Players do not want to hear you reading out of a book. Also, again, and really in most cases in this book, this last area on the page is split and continued on the next page. Instead of just complaining here, I want to show you how I would present these 3 areas and the bat-infested hallway on this page using DCC rules in this particular case. Notice how I can get the same information communicated with much fewer words, and by allowing the words to breathe on the page, they're way easier to reference. Check out the very next page of this dungeon. This is an even better example of the problem. The text walls are completely egregious and maximally difficult to use, but also notice that awesome old school artwork. But see, I want awesome old school illustrations like this, but also a more sensible, modern, practical approach to communicating the area descriptions. And that's where the Devoured Labyrinth comes in. The Devoured Labyrinth is a 122-page collection of adventure locations keyed to the Shadow Dark RPG rule set. It was put together by Andrew Bishkinski and Zach Goins and written by about 20 different people. All the maps were done by Dyson Logos. The adventures are sorted in a couple of ways. First, they're sorted by appropriate character level, so depending on your Shadow Dark party's level, you will want to engage with different adventures in the book. Then there are either firmly located or flexibly located hexes on an area map, but upon closer reading, these hex locations hardly matter. I think the designers were sort of caught between wanting to create a completely flexible collection of mini adventures that can be inserted into a larger campaign, and wanting to add some more persistent setting and region details in order to make this collection of adventures sort of coalesce into what might almost be considered an identifiable region of a world. I want to show you this pair of random encounter tables before jumping into the first dungeon. It's a minor issue that I have with Shadowdark and really a lot of old school D&D products, and it's that these encounter tables can be so painfully generic without any overarching theme besides fantasy. But I've seen this so many times at this point that I've resigned myself to just making my own random encounter tables for adventures when the necessity arises. But on to the incredible accomplishment of this supplement, and really of Kelsey Dion's Shadowdark. This is a 12-room dungeon right here, the whole thing across 2 pages. There's a title, which, okay, I'm not a fan of the barely legible old English font, but it's there, it's bold, it's impossible to miss. Then there's a 51 description of this dungeon. That's it. Just one short paragraph, carefully crafted to be relatively quite loaded with backstory and unanswered questions. And then check out the anatomy of a Shadowdark area description. First of all, we're looking at 7 lines of text on this first one, each line containing 5 to 7 words. There's the name and number of the area in underscored bold, then a short area description in italics with key details also in bold. Under that are those key details again in bold with just the most crucial information needed to flesh out a description on the fly. People on YouTube have already made 1,000 videos about this, and Kelsey herself has amply discussed why she engineered this approach to dungeon descriptions and why it works, but I can't stress enough how much better this is for prepping a dungeon than the old way found in the Caverns of Thracia. On the next page, we see examples of one-page dungeons. It should be noted that your players would probably be able to churn through a lot of these dungeons pretty quickly, considering they only contain a handful of combat encounters each, and often not that many rooms with very much going on in them. But the amount of prep required to get these dungeons to the table is about as minimal as it gets. You really just have to read the page once and then use the page during the session as the reference. Whereas with a traditional dungeon, you would really need to write out all of your notes, basically translating the walls of text into a usable shorthand for the session. The pages of this book are the shorthand. But is the Shadowdark approach the best way? There are definitely some disadvantages here. For one, adventures presented in this way do not have the same richness as a Caverns of Thracia. I'll give you one of many, many examples of this. In Area 112 of Caverns of Thracia, adventurers will come upon a green glowing human skull with ram's horns floating 15 feet above the ground. It will chuckle ominously and speak,
"Speak, petitioner, and have thy say, that I may answer yea or nay."
Then every character can ask a yes or no question, which the skull will answer truthfully. Then it will say,
"Now the answers to you are made known, and ye now are each Thanatos' own."
Then a small white skull-shaped blemish will appear on the back of every character's right hand. At least everyone who asked the skull a question. And those characters, if they ever drop to 3 or fewer hit points, will be able to see the incarnation of death, which appears as a tall, gaunt man in flowing robes. But those characters who bear the mark and are above 3 hit points at that moment will not be able to see the incarnation. Overall, that is very rich stuff, and Caverns is filled to the brim with this kind of heady, imaginative, old school dungeon goodness, to the point that the adventure feels like required reading if you ever plan on designing a dungeon yourself. The Devoured Labyrinth doesn't have stuff like that. It can't have stuff like that because it would take too many words to describe. So if you want those kinds of delicious details in a Shadowdark style dungeon, as a GM, you're going to have to insert it yourself, whole cloth. When all is said and done here, the pros and cons between these two dungeon design approaches are pretty obvious. For Caverns of Thracia and the literally hundreds of similar adventures that Goodman Games has published for Dungeon Crawl Classics and dozens so far in 5e, you're getting richness, a cohesive campaign story arc, more room for faction play, and the higher possibility of coming away feeling that the dungeon is a living thing. The obvious cons are that the prep time is arduous, running the scenarios requires a tremendous amount of cognitive load, It's difficult to reference the material mid-session, and in most cases, the layout creates a lot of annoying page flipping. All that culminates in a very hostile product for new GMs, as well as experienced GMs who lead busy lives with a lot of other competing interests and priorities besides hours and hours of session prep. The Devoured Labyrinth and its Shadow Dark approach sits orthogonally to all of this. Everything is dead simple to prep, reference during play is optimized to the point that it almost can't get any better, and the lack of minute details actually trusts the GM's imagination and gives them room to improvise and come up with interesting novel details. The generic quality of the adventures also allows them to be modular, just dropped into any larger campaign. And all of this culminates into an approach that is very welcoming to new GMs and very convenient for more experienced GMs who want to run a dungeon but who are limited on time to prep. But of course, this approach can feel pretty sparse, and you can't just run generic dungeons all the time. As a GM running these low prep dungeons, it's incumbent upon you to add some spice and variety. And as far as the Devoured Labyrinth, there really is no strong underlying meta story or unifying campaign arc. I know that's not what the creators intended to accomplish, but I still consider it something that I found myself yearning for by the end of reading it. One thing that I need to point out here, since I'm comparing two actual products, is that when prepping the material, I found that I had to do a lot less grunt work with the Devoured Labyrinth due to the extensive digital supplementation that the digital version comes with. With Caverns of Thracia, you get a clean, bookmarked PDF, but that's it. If you want to actually print the maps out for a physical game and use the artwork for creatures and NPC tokens, you'll need to extract all of those assets from the PDF yourself and cobble together your assets. With the Devoured Labyrinth, again, we're on the opposite end of the spectrum, where every map, every hex icon, every possible asset that can be derived from the book has been derived in digital format and provided. This is a very GM-friendly way of doing things, and I don't think it would take much for Goodman Games to follow suit moving forward. I think both of these books represent mastery of their respective approaches, and the hobby benefits from this kind of diversity in design philosophy. Which approach is right for you personally really boils down to a few factors. How much GM prep can you tolerate? And what do your players want? Do they want to scratch the very primal itch of just going room to room, killing monsters, facing traps, and gathering treasure? The Shadow Dark approach delivers the goods very efficiently at minimal cost to you as the GM. Or do players want to get entrenched in a deeply detailed, though highly improbable, fantasy Greco-Roman mega dungeon with 8 different factions and strange puzzles and traps in almost every room? For that kind of experience, there's just a lot more investment, especially for the GM. Personally, I'd like a bit of both. I want the Caverns of Thracia rendered into a Shadow Dark style presentation, though maybe with a bit more flesh on each area description than what Kelsey's approach would call for. I want the genius of Janelle's mega dungeon, but maybe 30% of the reading. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject in general, and if you think a dungeon like Caverns of Thracia could be rendered down into a more modern, fast, and easy to use format. Also, let me know if you've run Caverns or any of the adventures from the Devoured Labyrinth yourself and what your prep experience was like. I've left links down below to where you can find all this stuff. Thanks as always for watching.